Our next speaker is Savannah Esquivel, and she is a professor of art history at UC Riverside. She happens to have graduated from my alma mater, the University of Chicago, more recently, and she is also a former fellow at the Huntington Library, and also a faculty affiliate in her present role of the UCLA Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. She is working hard at work at a book-length project tentatively titled, and maybe the title has changed, Indigenous Insiders, Sights, Sounds, and Cross-Cultural Interactions in Mexico's Early Colonial Monasteries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Esquivel.
Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction, Christina, and for the invitation to be here. And also to Mark, to the museum staff who make all of these wonderful events possible, as well as the Toma Foundation. Wow, this light is like right in my eye. Let's see if I can twist this a little bit. Okay, it is just such a delight to be here today. So today I'm going to tell you a ghost story. The curious incident happened at a Franciscan monastery in central Mexico in 1556. 32 years earlier, the Franciscans had established a network of missions in Mexico, then called New Spain, to convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism. And let's see, I have a cursor? Yep, okay. There we go. So here's Mexico City. Over here is Tlaxcala. This is a mountain range here, and then this is actually an active volcano that you can kind of use to orient yourself in space. And while I have the map up on the screen, I would just like to point out that just down the street, there's the Church of San Miguel, right, which was founded by the Franciscan missionaries. But the people who built that church and those first settlers actually came from Tlaxcala, which is right here, and that's where our ghost story takes place today. And they were forcibly marched all the way up to Santa Fe. So Santa Fe has this incredible connection to Tlaxcala. So one of the first places where our mission was established was Tlaxcala, which was an indigenous Nahua provincial town located about 2 hours east of Mexico City. The monastery stands at the top of a short, steep hill, and that's where our story takes place. It all began one Friday during Lent. As the afternoon sun began to fade to darkness, the monastery's lay brother, a Franciscan friar named Miguel, was busy in the refectory setting the table for the day's meager meal. And this is the church here, what the building looked like in the 1550s. And then the refectory is going to be this long room over here. It's surrounded by a cloister. The entrance to the building is here, and then over on the other side is the chapter room, a space I'll talk about a little bit later. So the afternoon sun had begun to fade to darkness. The monastery's lay brother, Fray Miguel, was setting the table for the evening meal. As Fray Miguel returned from the kitchen with a pitcher of water, a curious thing happened. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the outline of a hooded figure drifting away from him and towards the refectory office, the room where the friars kept the books that were read aloud during the meals. And at this monastery here, which neighbors Tlaxcala and is in much better condition, the refectory office is this space behind the table where the father guardian would have sat. There would have been a wall here and a door once upon a time, but this monastery has had many lives. It was a hospital, it was a jail, it was a barracks. So walls tend to move around in these buildings, but we can imagine that Fray Miguel is kind of standing over here and that he sees something headed, towards the back of the room over there. Let's see. So at that moment, the monastery's 3 priests were in the church. This left Fray Miguel alone in the refectory, or so he thought. Without trepidation, the friar called out to the mysterious figure in a loud voice. At the same moment, the shadow slipped into the office. Placing the pitcher on the table, Fray Miguel set off to discover who it was creeping about the monastery. He had more courage than his station might have suggested. Before arriving at Tlaxcala, Fray Miguel had served a priest on the frontier in lands hostile to the Spanish. Years later, he would recall the harrowing scenes of that bloody enterprise. But for now, those visions were banished to the past. Standing at the threshold of the refectory office, Fray Miguel pulled open the door. To his surprise, there was no one visible in the room. It must be my mind playing tricks on me, he thought. He looked back across the refectory at the long shadows cast by the setting sun and got back to work. That night, there's the detail of the refectory office. Okay, so yeah, spooky figure back there behind the table. Okay, so that night, however, another odd thing happened. Fray Miguel was deep in prayer inside the church. And incidentally, just to set the scene, the Church of Tlaxcala is not so much larger than the space that we're in today. So you can kind of imagine these events, playing out behind you and around you if we were to turn the lights off. Because Miguel was deep in prayer inside the church, but it was after 3 a.m., and the priests had long retired to their cells, having chanted the midnight matin service. Once again, Fray Miguel was alone and shrouded in darkness, save for the flickering light thrown by the altar's chancel lamp. Standing up to return to the dormitory, Fray Miguel once again saw a vision. This form of a hooded friar was clearly etched against the glow of the candlelight. To his shock and dismay, the figure started moving towards him. Suddenly, face to face with the ghost, Fray Miguel demanded the specter identify itself and its intention. "What are you looking for over there, brother?" he asked. Turning away from Miguel and towards the altar in the tabernacle, the ghost replied with its own question. "Well, you do not see what I am looking for?" and then gazed towards the Eucharist, the consecrated host which was regarded as a symbol of salvation. Like a shock, Fray Miguel realized he had heard this voice before. But that missionary had recently died, killed on the frontier. The memory of that fateful enterprise came back to him clear as day, and then two things happened at once. In a flash, Fray Miguel realized he was speaking to a purgatorial spirit. At that same moment, the ghost vanished. That was not the end of the haunting, however. Afterwards, the ghost silently stalked Fray Miguel for 10 days, circling the cloister every night until finally disappearing into the ether. Ghosts always have an agenda, but so too do the authors who record uncanny tales. This ghost story first appeared in Franciscan Jerónimo de Mendieta's 1595-96 Chronicle of the Mission de Historia Ecclesiastica Indiana, 42 years after the incident in the church occurred. Now, missionary chronicles claim to be authoritative accounts of the experiences of the missionaries as they attempted to convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism. Scholars have looked to these sources to figure out big questions, such as how did religious conversion happen, colonial settlement, and what were the impact of these processes on indigenous cultures and lifeways. My approach has been different. I'm interested in how missionary chronicles were works of literature, that is, narratives that shaped the ideas, actions, and imaginations of the missionaries in their own time. Stories like the ghost story were copied, recopied, and circulated among the Franciscans in their own time, forming part of a common literary tradition that united missionaries from Spain to Mexico to New Mexico. Every ghost wants something. And as it turns out, this story tells us. While I have been calling this tale a ghost story, it should be more properly understood as a purgatory exemplum. These are the kinds of tales where unexpected things happen to ordinary, common people as a way to impart lessons to listeners and readers about the afterlife and the need to repent one's sins before heading there. This was a very old genre by the time Mendieta recorded the story of the strange encounter at Tlaxcala. But after the Council of Trent in 1563, purgatory, that liminal place between heaven and hell, had become a controversial topic again. Because the story was a didactic tale about doctrinal issues, however, we can assume it was directed at the friars. Now, Franciscans gathered weekly inside the monastery to read the spiritual biographies of exemplary Franciscans and Catholic saints. And presumably, that's where they might have encountered the ghost story. And here I'm showing you the chapter room of the nearby monastery at Huejotzinco. And incidentally, we were just talking during the Q&A about this painting over here, where we have 12 kneeling Franciscans flanking a cross, right? And they're in this kind of donor portrait position over here. Along the walls, we have these incredible grisaille paintings that were done in 1556 by indigenous artists, and they're showing different saints. Here we have Saint Francis flanked by different scenes of his life. And now that I'm looking at this, I see a central figure, and then I see 4 scenes that are read in this order, which is kind of incredible. Okay, the reason I'm showing you this room is because at Tlaxcala, the murals in the original chapter room do not survive. So this gives us kind of a best sense of the types of spaces where missionaries were reading literature about saints and talking about saints. Let's see. So because chronicles were written by and for other missionaries, they provide a crucial source for understanding how Franciscans constructed ideas of corporate identity, including saintliness. Like any work of literature, the narratives thus had an agenda. And so for the last few years, I've been getting a lot of my energy to reading Mendieta's Chronicle Against the Grain by comparing his narratives to the actual architectural spaces where the stories took place. There are inconsistencies between the two that poke holes in the accounts, but also subtle details that open up new mysteries to unravel. On their own, many of these anecdotes aren't particularly interesting. A ghost showed up at the monastery, they prayed for him, it disappeared. But what's fascinating to me is the context that they open up. How one narrative can provide a window onto a whole world of issues, architectural, conceptual, theological, that are swirling about unstated in the text because they were implicit and familiar to their core readership, the Franciscan friars. So elsewhere, I've written about the site of the haunting, the Tlaxcala Monastery, showing how its many anomalous features made it the perfect setting for a ghost story. But today, I want to turn my attention to the story's main characters instead and answer a fundamental question. Who was the ghost? And why did it appear to Fray Miguel? And by the end of today's talk, I hope to have shown you that Fray Miguel played a pivotal and early role in kind of laying the foundation for efforts made by the Franciscan missionaries to promote some of what Christina called the local guys into beatification and canonization, into the sainthood. So if you were here at Christina's lecture last night, and let's just go back and look at this beautiful photograph because, where'd my photograph go? My slides are out of sync. There we are. Okay. If you were here last night for Christina's lecture, you learned that in 1565, the Council of Trent changed the game when it came to canonization. And remember, our story of the ghost takes place in 1553. Making someone a saint was now a complex, multi-step process that, much like a trial in a court of law, would require a case presented that was based on compelling written evidence, as well as interviews. This was a bit of a problem for the Franciscan missionaries. They had already spent several years in New Spain, and several members of their organization had been martyred on the frontier, where there were very few Catholics who lived to tell the tale of this kind of suffering and sacrifice. So they have an evidentiary problem, right? They've sent people abroad, some have been martyred, but they don't have any witnesses. Fray Francisco Lorenzo was one of them. His biography circulated widely, appearing in print for the first time in Fray Marques de Lisboa's 1557 Chronicle of Illustrious Franciscans. 38 years later, when Mendieta picked up the pen and wrote the story of Fray Francisco for his own chronicle, he modeled his version of the martyrdom mostly on Lisboa's authoritative account. But he had an agenda. To make the push for canonization, Mendieta realized that he needed not just a backstory, but proof that this charismatic friar had inhabited a level of sanctity that bridged realms. And as it turns out, one of Mendieta's new sources may have been Fray Miguel, whose testimony Mendieta would have had the opportunity to hear directly when he served as the father guardian of the Tlaxcala monastery in 1585 and 1591. Now, shortly before the ghost appeared to Fray Miguel at Tlaxcala, there we go, the lay brother had served alongside a notable missionary on the frontier of the viceroyalty. From around 1551 to 1555, Fray Miguel had been the trusted companion of that Fray Francisco Lorenzo, a zealous proselytizer who was working in what is now Michoacan and Jalisco. Together, the pair reportedly founded a dozen missions in pursuit of Christian religious conversion amongst the semi-nomadic indigenous peoples of this mountainous region west of Mexico City. But this region was hostile to the Spanish, and wars erupted there frequently. That did not deter Fray Francisco Lorenzo, and on 2 occasions, the missionaries actually narrowly escaped death. Native warriors burned to the ground the churches established by Fray Francisco and Fray Miguel, but they also staged mock executions of the missionaries inside the churches. But each time, Fray Francisco accepted his fate with calm resignation, laying down at the altar prostrate, much to the alarm of Fray Miguel, who was like, let's get out of here. At some point, Fray Lorenzo sends Fray Miguel back to the safety of central Mexico to the monastery of Tlaxcala. And it's unclear why. The chronicles never explain why Fray Miguel left his companion behind on the frontier. In his place, another young lay brother, again, and a lay brother is somebody who is not an ordained priest, but rather who takes a vow of service in support of the Franciscan priests so that they can concentrate on ministry, but also prayer. So, they're kind of the Nacho Libres of these scenes. I'm so glad somebody has seen that movie. It helps a lot. Okay, so another lay brother was sent to support Fray Francisco on the frontier. But soon after, the native warriors returned, and once again, they attacked the small mission chapel on the frontier. This time, they clubbed Fray Francisco to death with their macana, which is a long stick that has pieces of sharp volcanic glass called obsidian in it. So, this is a really violent, powerful weapon. And they clubbed him to death with their macana as he lay at the foot of the altar, and the new lay brother stood by his side and was also executed. Now, news of Fray Francisco Lorenzo's violent death on the frontier reverberated throughout New Spain. But the unfortunate events also made Fray Francisco a candidate for beatification. He had been martyred. And this was something that the priest had wanted desperately in his own life, as he put himself time and again, in position to be killed in the service of converting native peoples to Catholicism. Now, all of this put Fray Francisco's sole living companion, Fray Miguel, at the center of a growing paper trail being created to prove Fray Francisco's case. As the priest's companion, Fray Miguel was the primary witness in this case for beatification, and he figures prominently in only Mendieta's version of the events and other versions later written in Mexico. Missionaries considered martyrdom in the northern provinces triumph over the indigenous peoples who fiercely resisted Spanish infiltration. While the death of Franciscan missionaries in Nagasaki, Japan in 1597 galvanized the writing of martyr tales and the codification of martyrological norms, Mendieta's accounts of the gruesome deaths of missionaries in the second part of his chronicle represented the first set of hagiographies of the mission's proto-martyrs. In general, the accounts are concise statements that weave together biographical data with a dramatic vignette that testifies to the piety and the zeal of the missionary, And this is often followed by an evocative and yet grisly account of the friar's death at the hands of the so-called barbarians who wielded bows, arrows, and clubs. But Mendieta's account of Fray Francisco is notable in its length and its level of precision. It was as if he had a new source. Using Fray Miguel's testimony, Mendieta painted a detailed portrait of an avid proselytizer and penitent, casting Fray Miguel as a faithful and virtuous companion whose timidity and naivete sharpens the picture of Francisco as a true apostle of Christ. So as a literary narrative, what was this ghost story doing? First, the story prefaces the martyrological tales that appear later in the Chronicles and which readers like Franciscans in the chapter rooms would have encountered when they were reading about Fray Francisco and his faithful companions. It also crystallizes the decade of the 1550s, so a moment before the reforms of the Council of Trent, as a high point in the mission, showing that there were charismatics in New Spain at this early moment, right, as a way to legitimize their holiness and, to address the fact that canonization criteria were shifting at this time. It also demonstrates that Fray Francisco could communicate with the other side. He speaks, right, in the choir to Fray Miguel that fateful night. His return shows that he had repented his sins and he was now in heaven, right? Even martyrs have to spend a little time in purgatory. The story, importantly, also works to illustrate Miguel's credibility as a witness to moments of divine intervention and the eruption of the miraculous in the world. And in fact, there's a number of little Fray Miguel stories that are sprinkled liberally throughout the chronicle. He might see a floating host. He might talk to so-and-so who has a vision later, right? So he becomes this kind of in the background figure who functions as a credible witness to tales of the miraculous. Finally, Fray Miguel offered an opportunity for Mendieta to demonstrate the humility and obedience of the core that made up the core virtues of lay brothers. So, given the indispensability of Fray Miguel's testimony to Mendieta's hagiographical enterprise, the incident of the ghost at Tlaxcala was a crucial episode in a more extensive project of Franciscan myth-making. The visitation of a purgatorial spirit associated with the missionary frontier prefaced Mendieta's accounts, but they also made a physical connection through the body of Miguel between the frontier and the mission's core in central Mexico, showing that there was an apocalyptic zeal for indigenous ministry that carried on to the afterlife. But importantly, Fray Miguel was a lay brother. And so there was one last little bit of work that this story was doing. It was participating in what became an emergent cult of pious Franciscan lay brothers. By the time Mendieta interviewed Fray Miguel, he was already aware that lay brothers were lightning rods for the miraculous. This cult included the beatified Santo de Aparicio, a Franciscan lay brother who joined the order in 1575 and died at San Francisco in Puebla in 1600. In life, Fray Sebastian was known for many things. In death, he was also exceptional. Today, the uncorrupted corpse of Fray Sebastian, for example, is preserved in a special chapel inside this Franciscan church in Puebla. Directly above his glass sarcophagus is a polychrome sculpture of the Virgin and the infant Christ that Cortez had carried into battle against the Aztecs. And there are many similarities between the account of Santo Aparicio, first written by Mendieta, who was actually leading the charge initially for his beatification process. He was one of the, we'll say, prosecutors, if you will, and the story of Fray Miguel, which maybe he wrote in hindsight. They both emphasize menial labor, the kind of unforgiving work that is happening on the streets and inside the monasteries, such as setting tables. But these are also figures who were visited by people from the other side, whether they be saints or purgatorial spirits. So there's echoes between Santo Aparicio's accounts, his later hagiographies, and these early stories of Fray Miguel, of which I gave you one. right? So before there was Santo Aparicio, there was Fray Miguel. And in missionary literature, the exemplary conduct of humble lay brothers like Miguel and later Sebastian encouraged Franciscans to pursue their religious calling with greater intensity. They also provided a pathway to holiness outside of ordination, outside of the priesthood. And this was important because at that moment, the Franciscans were struggling to recruit new priests, and this predicament was making them more and more reliant on auxiliaries, such as lay brothers. So in the case of the ghostly apparition at Tlaxcala, Mendieta's account of Miguel's encounter with the dead spirit offered a blueprint for a new type of holy lay brother that was later echoed in biographies of Santo Aparicio and others. More than a simple tale of something that goes bump in the night, then, Mendieta's ghost story set in motion important conversations and created a paper trail that led to the beatification and the canonization of local Franciscans. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Savannah. And are there any questions?
Thank you for that talk, Savannah. That was great. Can you provide another level of context for either reminders for us who know and have forgotten, or for the first time for some of us who might be meeting Mendieta for the first time? He's writing Historia Ecclesiastica. No, what is the? Yeah, with the goal of it being published where? And for he's writing this manuscript to become a book, right?
Right. Okay.
So can you give a little bit more of that next level of the sort of intended publication and audience? Did it need to go
Yeah. So
Thank you.
I love this picture here because it shows that these histories of the mission were written in volumes. And this is a later one by Juan de Torquemada, which used quite a bit of material from Mendieta's early history. But often art historians and historians focus on the first half of these books, and that's where you kind of get a blow-by-blow history of what the missionaries are doing. They arrived in 1524. By 1530, they had done this. There was some incidents along the way. And it's a really interesting conversation about the strategies for religious conversion amongst the native people. But the books at the back were the ones that were directed specifically towards the missionaries in New Spain. So rather than being kind of a larger history that might be published in Spain, as this one later was, and circulated amongst people who were unfamiliar with the mission or were critical of the Franciscans and their approaches to religious conversion, the stories at the end became kind of the spiritual fodder for the missionaries themselves, who found themselves in a new place and didn't have a deep literary tradition about the local guys, right? The people who were their immediate predecessors and those people around them who were doing really interesting things. So one of the things that I think is so interesting about Mendieta's chronicle, and that makes it a bit of a departure from another earlier history by Motolinea that comes a little bit before that, is that this is the first time that we get somebody who's writing literature for fellow missionaries, right? To kind of start this literary tradition that becomes later a major part of the process of canonizing saints, but also establishing various kinds of norms. Does that kind of get at are there kind of any?
Can I get a clarification on when Mendieta died?
Yeah, so Mendieta died, when did Mendieta die? Died before 1615. Early 1600s, is it 1610 that I think that he dies? And his chronicle isn't published until the 19th century. But that ostensibly didn't matter because every one of these monasteries has a scriptorium. It's a place where people, usually indigenous people, are copying over texts that are going to be moved and circulated through the monasteries. Again, because Franciscans are, they're ministers, they're professional prayers, but they're also doing a lot of reading, and they want to read things about the local guys. So these texts were really kind of vital, and I think overlooked documents. Asuncion Lavrin has done a wonderful job kind of paving the way for thinking about these chronicles as sources of literature for the missionaries themselves and being used to construct ideas of identity. But I think we can take that a little bit further and see how they connect the dots to other issues, and in this case, the canonization or the beatification of Franciscan missionaries.
That's interesting. So the suggestion, of course, is now that they're reading the manuscript version of Mendieta, and then soon after, Torquemada's version, which is published in 1615, but they're probably not reading 1615 because that was very scarce, probably 18th century, because most of 1615 is lost on a shipwreck, and it's only the second edition that really circulates. So maybe the publication, 18th century, or maybe a manuscript version of it. But for Sebastián de Aparicio, they're probably reading Torquemada's publication of 1602.
Yes, yeah. And again, there's paper copies of these things that have been circulating around. Emmanuel Ortega has shown how in the 1700s, missionaries in Santa Fe have brought paper copies of some of these texts with them. We've lost most of this paper trail because the monasteries were secularized in the 1640s, so the missionaries had to leave. And then these buildings became jails, barracks, and hospitals. And so sometimes when I'm working in historical libraries, I see very damaged texts, or you hear about how, the paper in the library was burned because the soldiers needed fire. So we have sometimes few publications that give us a kind of a glimpse into this larger, manuscript history that was happening on the ground and really important to these missionaries and their various endeavors.
I just wanted to add something as the book person here, that Magdalena Chocano Mena has done really important work on the manuscript Oh, sure. Hello. Is that better? I just wanted to add that Magdalena Chocano Mena has done really important work on the idea of the manuscript as a prestige form of circulation versus published works. And that, of course, we will see manuscripts repeatedly cited in individuals' writings, in sermons, when we know they aren't printed yet. So I don't know how that figures into this, except for to say I would imagine whatever proliferation you've seen to go ahead and multiply that by multiple orders of magnitude.
The haunting occurs throughout Mendieta as well, right? So Fray Miguel is kind of a spectral presence throughout.
Right,
He
yeah,
haunts
and there's
the manuscript.
this really amazing way, and I think, one of the things that I'm kind of trying to work out here and thinking about this more literary approach to this space is how when we encounter figures in missionary chronicles, they're doing double work, right? We have the story of the real Fray Miguel. He was a historical person who worked with Fray Lorenzo. We have documents that show us that, right? At the same time, all of these individuals are becoming literary figures, right? And these are literary figures who are working within the literary tradition of the Franciscans, which is actually very deep and goes all the way back to St. Francis of Assisi and his early vitae, right? And so they're doing these kind of double work, right? And so I think I was trying to answer your question yesterday, the third question about how do we read these archives differently, right? How do we read some of our common sources in ways that open up new stories? And if we think about, maybe part of the work that's being done here, and I'm following Kathleen Donegan's incredible approach looking at the stories of the pilgrims at Plymouth, for example. And we think about how these stories are participating in discourses like canonization or narratives about holiness, right? There's another kind of subtext here that might be informing the decisions that the authors are making and the kind of information that gets reported, or in some cases absolutely does not appear in chronicles. And Fray Miguel kind of shows how that's working a little bit.
It's the Fray Miguel device.
The Fray Miguel device, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Savannah.
Thank you.